So greetings to you all. This is teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald, and we are going to go ahead and look at a series about respiration. We are going to go through some questions concerning respiration, and that is basically what we are going to be looking at. I hope you are all doing well. This is teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald, and today we are going to go ahead and look at an experiment. We're going to look at an experiment where we're looking at the different sources of energy during exercise. And this person was an athlete, and we're looking at the different sources of energy, or the different sources of energy from which he was extracting his energy that was sustaining him during exercise. You can clearly see we have a source of energy known as ATP present at the start of the exercise. We have from phosphocreatine, then we have energy derived from lactate fermentation. We also have some energy derived from respiration. So we are going to be looking at under which conditions he uses the energy that is derived from ATP, then the energy that is derived from phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate, then lactate fermentation and aerobic respiration. So the first question that we are having here is a question that is telling us to comment on the percentage contribution of each of the different sources of energy. You can see that we have a percentage. We are looking at percentage of energy used over time of the exercise or activity. So we are looking at what percentage of energy is contributed from the ATP that was extracted from the beginning, what percentage during the exercise is contributed from phosphocreatine, and what percentage is contributed by lactate acid fermentation. I remain teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald. Now, we shall start with the first question, which is telling us to comment. The first question is telling us to comment on the percentage contribution of each of the different processes. So our first one that we are having here is the process of ATP present from the start of the experiment. So you can clearly see that ATP present from the start of the experiment. At the start of the experiment, we have at the start, you can clearly see that 100% was contributed from ATP. And at the start, there is no energy, there is no contribution from either, no contribution from phosphocreatine, no contribution from either phosphocreatine or lactate fermentation, or aerobic respiration. So energy is purely, or a contribution of energy is purely from the ATP stores that are found in the body. So that is basically our comment. So at the start, we usually have all the energy that is sustaining the exercise being contributed all from ATP, and you can clearly see that as the experiment is continuing over time, we can see the contribution of ATP at the start keeps on drastically declines. Then you can clearly see that the contribution from phosphocreatine increases immediately as we are seeing a decrease in the contribution from ATP. You can see the contribution from phosphocreatine rises very sharply and thereafter also declines and spends a very short period of time of about 45 seconds. Then thereafter we can see that now we derive most of the energy used in the body is derived from aerobic respiration, which also lasts for some 60 seconds, and thereafter it also drops towards about and its contribution almost ends around 120 seconds. And you can see that energy derived from alcoholic fermentation or lactate fermentation increases gradually and then peaks when the exercise is prolonged. at around 120 seconds. So you can clearly see that is our comment. So when you are asked to talk about a comment, this is basically what you talk about. You talk about the contribution of each at the beginning of the experiment and the dominant one, and then you go ahead and talk about as well what happens thereafter. Then after there, you talk about what will happen towards the end of the experiment. You can clearly see that most of the energy during the exercise is derived from different sources. Now, when they tell us to explain the observed changes in the contribution, they are saying explain the observed changes in the contribution of each during the race: ATP, phosphocreatine, and lactate acid fermentation, and then aerobic respiration. So when you look at the observed changes, you can see clearly that at the start of the experiment, we shall look at the start, you can see that it is highest. At the start, it is the highest. We can see a contribution from ATP is highest. Why? Because our cells are usually having a very rich, abundant supply of ATP. So the energy that is used to sustain exercise for the start of about 10 seconds or 5 seconds, for the first 5 seconds, it is purely extracted from the ATP that is in the body and the ATP that is in the cells from hydrolysis of ATP. When ATP is hydrolyzed, we know very well that we usually have ATP being hydrolyzed to ADP and an inorganic phosphate. So that releases some energy, and this energy is the one that is used for sustaining the person during exercise. But we should note with maximum emphasis that the stores of ATP that are in the cells are usually short. They are usually very little in amounts, and they last for about only 5 seconds before they get exhausted. So that is why we can clearly see that after some time, there is a very sharp decline in the proportion of contribution by ATP, because the ATP stores are usually very short in shortage, but they are the first one that supply, but they supply for a short period of time and they get exhausted. So you can clearly see they supply for at least 5 seconds. After supplying 5 seconds, then we see exhaustion taking place. So they get exhausted. So after 5 seconds, they get exhausted. Then the body starts to derive energy from other sources during the exercise. So now, after ATP has been exhausted, then we start deriving energy from breaking down high energy phosphates. And one of the high energy phosphates that we have, this is a high energy phosphate. So when high energy phosphate is broken down, this high energy phosphate is broken down to produce energy, and that energy that is produced from the breakdown of the high energy phosphate from phosphocreatine to creatine and a phosphate. So the energy that is derived from the breakdown of this phosphocreatine is used to assemble more ATP, and that ATP that is usually assembled. So the breakdown of this substance here, as we break it down, so its breakdown releases energy, and that energy is very important for phosphorylating ADP to ATP. And now that ATP is going to be used for sustaining the body during activity. So we usually break down this high energy phosphate. When we break it down, we release energy. That energy is used for phosphorylating ADP to form ATP, and that is used for sustaining the body during exercise. But unfortunately, it also lasts for about a very few amount of seconds. According to our graph, it lasts for about only 45 seconds, and it gets used up. So it gets used up at around 45 seconds according to our graph. So you can see here that it is used up. So when it is used up, because it is usually in short supply, we derive energy from it for a very short period of time, and of which thereafter it gets used up. And then the body has to rely on other sources of energy for it to produce energy. So after phosphocreatine is done, or the high energy phosphate is done, then we can go ahead and start deriving energy from lactate fermentation. We know lactate fermentation, we usually have, in lactate fermentation, we usually have pyruvate, pyruvate receiving protons from NAD, H, we are converting it to NAD. So the reduced NAD donates protons and electrons, and then we end up with lactate. Now, when the body is deriving energy from aerobic lactate fermentation, you can clearly see that lactate fermentation immediately kicks in. In this context here, during lactate fermentation, we see conversion of conversion of pyruvic acid to lactate. So pyruvate is reduced to lactate, and in the due course, we see release of protons. We usually see oxidation of NADH. So NADH is oxidized to NAD, oxidized state. So when it is oxidized, this allows this creates a supply of these molecules known as oxidized NAD. So oxidized NAD can continue into glycolysis, and then we shall see more energy being produced from glycolysis. 2 ATP molecules produced from glycolysis. So these 2 ATP molecules produced from glycolysis will be able to sustain the activity. So it is very important for us to have this conversion taking place. Pyruvate being converted to lactate. When that conversion happens, it allows us to get more electron acceptors. So this electron acceptor will go back to glycolysis, and it will participate in the production of at least 2 ATP molecules from the process of glycolysis. And those 2 ATP molecules will sustain the body during the exercise for the next time. And by about, so you can see that after some time, even this energy is no longer sufficient. So it will supply these 2 ATP molecules come when everything is, even aerobic respiration is used up. So in this context here, we have lactate fermentation. So during lactate fermentation here, it kicks in even when aerobic respiration is no longer sufficient. So here we have production of 2 ATP molecules as a result of formation of oxidized NAD, which goes to glycolysis. When it goes to glycolysis, we get 2 ATP molecules. Then we see them sustaining the process of exercise. Now, aerobic respiration kicks in. This type of respiration, known as aerobic respiration, kicks in. It is the third. So if this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, then this one is the last one, the last result. So aerobic respiration kicks in immediately. Phosphocreatine stores are exhausted. So when we have phosphocreatine is exhausted, then aerobic respiration kicks in. In aerobic respiration, we see the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen to carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. So that's what we usually see. We usually see the breakdown of glucose in presence of oxygen, then produces carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And this amount of energy is about 38 ATP molecules in theory, and this is able to sustain the body during the exercise. But as we know very well that during the exercise, the rate at which supply of oxygen becomes so much lesser than the required amount of oxygen. So when supply of oxygen is far much lesser than the amount of oxygen required to sustain the body during exercise, then that is when the body switches on lactate fermentation. So you can see that the aerobic respiration supplies some energy for some good time, and you can clearly see that aerobic respiration does not go to zero, because even during the exercise, what usually happens is the proportion of aerobic respiration keeps on decreasing during exercise. So during the exercise, the proportion of aerobic respiration keeps on decreasing, and the proportion of anaerobic respiration what we are calling lactate fermentation keeps on increasing. But as the aerobic respiration decreases, it does not go to zero, but it keeps on decreasing as the proportion of anaerobic respiration keeps on increasing. So that is why you can see that here we are seeing a decrease in the energy derived from aerobic respiration, and we are seeing an increase in the energy derived from lactate fermentation. So lactate fermentation only kicks in after aerobic respiration can no longer produce sufficient amount of energy that are required to sustain this body during activity. So when the amount of energy that is required to sustain the body during activity is not being produced by aerobic respiration, then anaerobic respiration kicks in to produce an additional amount of energy within a very short period of time. It is very efficient because it converts the glucose. So every one glucose molecule will produce 2 ATP molecules, but they happen very fast. So we shall be able to produce very many glucose molecules and compared to aerobic respiration within a short period of time. But it is not efficient because it produces a waste. This substance here known as lactic acid is very important. It is very dangerous because it is the one that is responsible for what we usually call muscle cramps. For the sportsmen, they are aware about it. When it accumulates in the body, yes, we produce the energy, but it has side effects. The muscle cramps are they are very important. You will hear about muscle cramps or muscle pull. Then you can see the athletic falling immediately. So that is basically, so after an aerobic respiration, the energy that is produced from aerobic respiration is no longer sufficient. Then lactate fermentation kicks in to produce energy for this body. Now we can go ahead and look at. So sorry about that. We can go ahead and look at now. We have agreed that after the energy is derived from one, we first derive energy from ATP. After ATP is done, the next source of energy is phosphocreatine. After phosphocreatine is done, then we go to aerobic respiration. After aerobic respiration produces 38 ATP molecules, but usually for a short period of it is not sufficient. So because it is not sufficient, the body resorts to conversion of pyruvate to lactate. This happens outside the mitochondria, and it results into formation of only 2 ATP molecules, and that will be able to sustain the energy, the respiration, the energy supply. But as I told you that it does not decrease to zero, the proportion of aerobic respiration keeps on increasing as the proportion of anaerobic respiration keeps on decreasing during a physical exercise. It does not go to zero. But because you don't stop breathing, you will keep breathing, but the amount of energy, of oxygen that you are breathing in supply is far much lesser than the amount of oxygen that is required. Now, we can conclude by looking at why is it significant to have regular exercise. The importance of having regular exercise. Now, when you're having regular exercise, it is very important to your body because it trains your body to withstand oxygen deficiency. Now, first and foremost, when you have regular exercise, you will have a bigger heart. A bigger heart will mean a greater supply of oxygen to the actively respiring tissues. So you will have a greater, quicker oxygen supply to tissues. Your lung capacities will increase, so you will have greater lung volumes and capacities. You will have a greater tidal volume. You will breathe in the maximum amount of air that you will breathe in will be greater than the other average people. Then you will also have increased vascularization, increased heartbeat. You will have increased vascularization All these are good things about it. So your body will be more able. One, you will even have increased myoglobin. You will have increased myoglobin in your tissues. You will have increased a higher lung capacity. You will also have increased vascularization. Your body will have more blood vessels, and that will supply more oxygen to the active respiring cells. You will have, your lungs will be able to breathe in more oxygen or more air compared to the normal ones, and that will ensure that you will have a higher efficiency of respiration because you will have more oxygen. And that means that you will have less lactic acid accumulation in your body because your body will efficiently bring in more oxygen, efficiently take out more carbon dioxide, efficiently store enough oxygen, so you will have a lesser proportion of anaerobic respiration happening in your body. So thank you so much for listening. We have been looking at respiration, and that has been teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald, and we have been looking at the different sources of energy during exercise. For splinters, for them, they rely more on ATP, phosphocreatine, and aerobic respiration. But for long distance runners, they will have to have a very high efficiency, a high concentration of myoglobin, and they rely more from lactate fermentation because they sustain the exercise for a long period of time. Please, if you've enjoyed the video, please consider to like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues. I remain teacher Dr. Mugomba Ronald. Have a good time. Till next time.